How's it going, folks? Jack here with another video on Kursgesagt that was requested for me to react to. This one has nothing to do with physics per se, although one could make arguments that brain chemistry does involve a little bit of physics, but nothing about glassing the entire world. No, this one is about something that might have been considered to be just as dangerous in the past. Weed. And I do believe that it does require... hold on a minute. A little bit of a color change, yeah, that's better. Now, I have zero or next to no knowledge about weed per se. I did remember that I made a presentation that somewhat had the involvement of weed back in high school because as the American fan that I am, I did make a presentation of how the economy failed in the 80s, or at least how the US government was trying to salvage 20 years of failure through the Reagan administration and inevitably created the insane wealth disparity that was there. But in the early 70s, it was weed, that is, was classified as a Schedule I drug, meaning that it was made illegal and prohibited. So yeah, the government truly had the priorities in order. Fix the economy? No. Make the rich richer and the poor poorer and ban weed. But in a more personal level, as an exit to high school during like an architectural project that we were doing, we went on a trip to Amsterdam, actually a bike trip it ended up being, where I just could not stand the streets. Unfortunately, a lot was just smelling of weed everywhere and it wasn't pleasant. Like even across like Anne Frank's house, which you kind of have to visit, there is a church that Vestekirk, where there's literally a weed shop behind the church. Like, I understand that people like to get elevated, but that's not how you reach heaven. Anyways, Kursgesagt has a video on the subject, and I'm interested to know where they are going with this.
Cannabis has been vilified to a ridiculous degree for the last century, but it's now finally being decriminalized in more and more places around the world. It's just recently been legalized in Germany, and for very good reasons. Compared to legal drugs like alcohol, which will cause 1 in 20 deaths just this year, cannabis is pretty mild. So to justify harsh prosecution and punishment, its negative effects have been wildly overstated. Naturally, there was a lot of pushback, and here's something went wrong.
Yeah.
If you followed the discourse over the last few years, you might have got the impression that weed has almost only upsides and few, if any, negative side effects.
I noticed the Kursgesagt experience there, so that's a nice touch. They always tend to put up a lot of Easter eggs in the videos. But a thing about weed that I think often doesn't get mentioned is the other component of it, right? Like most people tend to focus on simply the psychoactive part of weed, which is the THC. But not so many people tend to talk about the CBD one, because perhaps it's the medical, at least the medical part that a lot of people are actually using, right? That gets prescribed to you. My mom, as an example, suffers from a lot of chronic pains beside her asthma, and so she has to take that to kind of help with that. And yeah, I don't know if a lot of the studies have focused on that and that part rather than the psychoactive, and that's how there's like a misunderstanding, or at least a mismatch in the mention of the other component. But anyways, let's keep going.
We ourselves contributed to that narrative. What made this worse is that criminalization made it very hard for scientists to study cannabis, especially its long-term effects.
Right.
They faced bureaucratic and legal hurdles, and studies often had to rely on small sample sizes.
Yeah.
In the last few years, this finally started to change, so it's time to bring new evidence to the discussion.
Yeah, isn't that funny that that is how drugs actually work? Like, as an example, nobody is legalizing fentanyl, okay? That thing should be removed from the face of the earth. But because of how well documented the usage of that thing is, we know so much about it. That's why whenever there are like reports about cops just being in the proximity of fentanyl just passing out, we know that it's bullshit because nothing backs that up. Which is of course not to say that scientific papers cannot come with conflicting information. That does tend to happen. But when we're looking at trends, especially with how we are able to trace like the potency of certain things and or the usage of like our devices, at least that's that's the approach that I often have, because that's not my field of expertise. I know it's like been more about programming than actually the program of the human brain. But yeah, following the trends that we're observing are a bit more telling than, let's say, somebody who's going out to sensationalize a topic just to get views.
And, well, it's not pretty. While weed is still much less harmful than alcohol, it does have a dark side. It is more addictive than we thought and can have significant negative effects if you use it long term.
Oh.
It seems that...
Keyboard warrior.
What are you doing? Before you tell us how dumb we are, please watch the video. To be crystal clear, we think prohibition doesn't work and cannabis should be legal. But this also means that we need to treat it as what it is, a drug with unique upsides and downsides. So let's take an honest look at some of the latest research together. Weed is getting stronger and stronger. Cannabis's magic juice is tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. It docks on your cannabinoid receptors, which affects various brain functions. THC activates some regions and calms down others, creating a fun cocktail of sensations.
If I may be so bold as to ask that, it's a weird thing. Okay, a bit of a personal explanation as to why this come about. My girlfriend works at like a children's store, and because this is Christmas season, at least very close to Christmas season, they are having a bunch of things to do, so we decided that I would work a bit less, she will work more. And so at the moment I am the parent who is constantly at home taking care of our child, and I will be reading her a bunch of books, namely one on the human body. And there are like chapters like the ones here about neurons that talk about the endocannabinoid system, which is pretty great, which is more or less something that is similar to the system that we already have, but of course more receptive to the weed or the cannabis. Because in our brain, the way that information travels from one organ to another or to enact a certain action is done through neurotransmitters, which of course travel through synapses. Now, when one synapse or when one neurotransmitter is traveling from one end to the other of the synapse, it sends with it a message. And endocannabinoids, when they go through that system, send a message in a different direction as to give a feedback to the original neurotransmitter. Now, the thing that we've come to understand so far is that these endocannabinoids can either, depending on your brain chemistry, amplify or kind of diminish certain signals. So that is the reason why some people are going to react differently depending on the amount of weed and or how the brain is just structured, right? Some will go through the Bradley Cooper experience of like limitless, when the brain is just going to be super active, whereas others will just be like Afro Man and be high all the time and experience that kind of slow down time. So it depends on what gets heightened or what it's lowered.
The more THC, the more intense the high. And people seem to be into higher highs, or at least this is what the market is providing. In the US, Canada and in Europe, the concentration of THC in legal and illegal cannabis products has more than doubled in the last few decades.
Yeah.
While ever more potent strains are bred, products like edibles or concentrates with more than 60% THC have become increasingly common. While the share of products with less than 15% THC has declined. Unfortunately, just about every problem weed creates gets worse at higher THC doses.
This image here makes me think of that one that I think a lot of you may have encountered of, I think it was a house in Amsterdam that was being raided by the police, that during winter clearly had some people growing weed in them because the patch at the top of the house was obviously always heated up, right? With no snow on top.
At the same time, more and more people use weed. In the US, more people consumed cannabis daily than alcohol for the first time in 2022.
Wow.
In Canada, 26% of people 16 and older use it, up from 22% in 2018. It's not possible to say if legalization is the reason for this though, since studies are pretty inconsistent and vary massively between different users. In some, consumption went up. In others, it stayed stable, and the trend to use more weed began in the early 90s and sped up in the 2000s, way earlier than legalization.
I just wonder, why pushes one under the age of 20 Like 1 in 4 under the age of 20 is consuming that much cannabis already. That's not good. Like we've talked about this before in previous videos, but like it is widely agreed that the brain fully develops around 25, right? Around that age. And the way that it's going to affect your brain, I don't know, but it's definitely going to leave a mark depending on your consumption. And perhaps you should just not do that at all.
So today, more people consume more weed than ever before in the last century, and it's the strongest it's ever been. What are we seeing as a result of this? Let's start with something that used to get you laughed out of the room: addiction.
Oh.
Weed addiction and withdrawal symptoms.
Well, it's real.
A big narrative about weed is that it's not addictive, or at least not that big of a deal. And for most people, this is true. Studies clearly show that the majority handle it well. For 8 out of 10 using weed, it's just a casual high and not problematic at all. About 2 in 10 users develop a cannabis use disorder, or CUD. CUD has 11 different symptoms, from the inability to stop when you've had enough, to using it when you know it will have negative consequences, to tolerance and withdrawal.
Oh, well, okay, obviously there's one thing here that I already expect them to talk about, which is the withdrawal part. And of course, it was mentioned before, when you are neglecting social cues and or social gatherings, for example. I will assume that many of the studies would have written in like the abstract of them that there should not be a direct correlation to this and the actual loneliness epidemic, because this is something that is already happening, but for a various of other reasons. Okay, there are things like the lack of third places for people to meet, things getting a bit more expensive, so people are focusing on themselves and perhaps socializing online. Those type of things, right, are contributing to that. But adding to that, weed, of course, makes the situation worse.
They can all basically be reduced to: you're doing it too often, even if it's bad for you, and it's less fun than it could be. There are 3 major risk factors here: the amount of THC, how often you consume, and your age when you start using cannabis. The more THC, the more often, and the younger you are when you start, the higher your risk. If you smoke too much weed too often, it will have negative impacts on your life. So if this is you, toning it down a bit will make a big difference. 1 in 10 users develops a serious addiction. They usually consume daily, and their life is significantly impaired or held back because they spend a lot of their time either using or recovering from cannabis use. Since their brain is building a tolerance, they need increasingly high doses or stronger weed, often both. Studies found a variety of negative effects. Heavy users can experience bad moods, feel irritable, restless, paranoid, anxious, and even depressive. In a sad twist of irony, for many addicts it feels like they need weed to fight these symptoms.
Yeah, like the smoking episode, that's the unfortunate situation, right? Every single thing puts you in a feedback loop. The same thing with other drugs. Friends who are working in pediatrics at the moment who have talked to me about how they were writing studies about like limb transplantation? No, prosthetic transplantation. Limb transplantation, what? That does occur, okay? That does occur, like people wanting to who have been in a severe burn or something, getting part of the flesh on the wound or whatever. But that's not what I'm getting at. Actual prosthetic transplantation, who are then writing papers about how they want to give them as least potent painkillers as possible, because those do create an addiction. And unfortunately for many, the way to even cope the addiction of the painkiller is to take even more painkillers. It is wild. When our mind and body betrays us. But I mean, that's what those compounds do. That's how our brain chemistry is. We can't run away from it.
Maybe it did actually help at first, while in reality, it makes those symptoms stronger and more persistent. Studies also found that loneliness and frequent cannabis use go hand in hand. If you feel lonely, you're more likely to use weed, and if you use weed, you may experience more loneliness. It's not always easy to say which came first, but they seem to reinforce each other. So on the one hand, cannabis makes loneliness feel much less bad. On the other hand, it can also make you feel more socially awkward than you actually are and withdraw from friends. This can lead to a downward spiral that ends in self-isolation and chronic loneliness. Another thing many people who consume a lot experience is a mental numbness that makes boredom feel okay because it impacts the reward system of your brain. Not great, but good enough. You can spend your days killing time binging mildly interesting stuff, being numb rather than having fun. Boredom is a signal to your mind to get creative or learn something new, but this is suppressed. This also makes quitting so much harder because your daily routines suddenly seem boring and unexciting, making it very tempting to go back.
Oh, this one is hard. I have personally gone through phases in my life where I felt like numbness was the answer to everything because it actually helped me go through things, go through the motions of the daily life without much struggle because I did not need to feel highly positive or negative about something. But yeah, this is not great.
If you find yourself using constantly, this can also stunt your development as a person. The numbness dulls bad feelings, making it easy not to deal with them. But in life, you can only get over bad feelings if you actually feel them, and you have to process them to grow. Lastly, let's talk about physical withdrawal symptoms. The more you consume, the worse they'll be for you, especially if you use daily. Withdrawal can cause headaches and sweating or chills, decreased appetite, in severe cases even fever, nausea and abdominal pain. You might have trouble falling asleep, and if you do, you might have disturbing and vivid dreams. The withdrawal can put you in a depressive mood where life feels daft and pointless. You can feel restless, angry, anxious, or nervous. You may feel unable to do anything at all. After a few days, these symptoms will begin to subside, and after a few weeks, they'll be gone entirely. The exact time depends on how much and how long you've been consuming cannabis. Now, let's get to the worst part.
Oh, that's worse.
Weed may damage your brain. This section was not fun to research because there's fierce debate among researchers how bad weed is for your brain and whether it has irreversible long-term consequences or not. There's no consensus yet, and it's hard to say anything definitive. Having said that, THC directly interferes with critical brain chemistry. There is some evidence that it may alter its structure. If it does, this may go away again if you quit after a few years, or not. We don't know yet. The consequences vary a lot between individuals, but especially for heavy users, they have a variety of potentially unfunny downsides. The most common one is that your memory gets significantly worse.
Okay, so naturally they have some papers there underneath that one can check, but I've heard this before. I thought that it was just like the thing that I mentioned before, like, I want to say mental tardiness, but that sounds so wrong. But it's being slow, like the effect of which you would have after consuming it, depending on how your brain works, but actually not remembering things. That sucks.
Sustained heavy use may reduce your ability to learn, your reasoning, perception, attention span, decision-making, language abilities, and impulse control. Most negative effects seem to go away or at least weaken over time after you quit, but again, we simply don't know enough and need more research. Where the evidence is much clearer is that consuming a lot of weed is really bad for teenagers on multiple levels. If you start using heavily early, you have many more years to build up potentially negative side effects. Teens who use a lot are much more likely to become addicted to weed. This may just be correlation and weed may not be the underlying cause, but heavy weed users are more likely to perform poorly in school and less likely to finish their education. They are, on average, less satisfied with their life and what they've achieved. This may simply be because if your memory and motivation are stunted, you have fewer interesting experiences and forget the ones you do have.
Kudos to the animators there. They do such a good job with this. But yeah, I think that we might have all heard a story about a classmate who seemed to have flunked something because of weed. Again, this is not directly the causation for which, because if you go and actually do care about your classmate and look into their lives, they already had some underlying issues to begin with. Numbing whatever they were going through with weed might have felt like a solution to begin with, but was not the right answer.
And there is strong evidence that teen users are way more likely to develop mental health issues like psychosis, schizophrenia, depression, or anxiety later in life.
Cognitive hazard, SCP-3000. Well played, Kursgesagt, or at least I expected that is the inspiration from it.
Once again, the younger you start, the higher the risk. And it also seems to rise massively with high THC doses, making highly potent cannabis products even more dangerous for teens.
Yeah.
Okay, let's wrap this up. We've only focused on the negative sides in this video. That was the whole point. As we said before, for most people, weed in moderation is totally fine and definitely way less harmful than alcohol. You do you, we're not your parents. The upside of moderation is also that when you do it, your experience will be more intense and special. But for teens, weed, especially using it regularly or a lot of it, is a bad idea, with potentially life-changing consequences. We know that criminalization did nothing to make this better. We now have a new chance under legalization. It begins with being open and honest about the state of science and acknowledging that weed is one drug among many others.
Yeah.
Certainly not the worst one by a long shot, but also problematic for at least 1 to 3 out of 10 people using it. If you really have to try cannabis, there is a time and place, and that's in your 20s. If you're younger, the science is clear, don't do it. At least, not yet. You'll have plenty of time to experiment later.
So I have like 1 year left before I can get into weeds. I don't think I will.
Let's do a different experiment now.
Well, thank you Kursgesagt for this amazing video. I might not be showcasing the ad in this because I don't suppose that is what you are here for, but I will still leave a link to the Optimist Nihilist shirts collection in the description below, and of course they have some deal with Odoo if you want to check that out as well. That being said, as always, a thing that is here is moderation. That applies with everything, not just drugs, even things that we find to be entertaining and well, just things that we consume in general. Do things in moderation and we are likely to always avoid the terrible side effects they might bring with them. But yeah, I did not know a lot of this about weed. I was actually expecting them to like do a little bit of the positive side and talk about CBD, but well, this one was a focus on the negative aspects, which is fair. That being said though, guys, thank you so much for checking out this video. As always, if you like to see some more of this type of sciencey stuff, there are more on the channel, of course. You can of course also subscribe to Kursgesagt and like the original video. That being said, wish you all to have a wonderful day. See you guys in the next one. Bye.